Hi, I'm Matt Cooper. I'm the Assembly Finance Committee Chair, and I'm here with Fairbanks North Star Borough Mayor Bryce Ward to talk a little bit about the budget. Mayor Ward's been working on the budget for some time, and it's just now landed in the hands of the Assembly. So, Mayor, why don't you tell us a little bit about where we're at with the budget in terms of timeline and how things move forward?
Yeah, good question, and thank you, Mr. Cooper. So we actually start doing our budget work back in December of last year. We go through a number of revisions within departments, and ultimately what you have before you in the Assembly right now is the final version that was finalized here within the office sometime around the early March. And so there's a number of things that have to go into calculating the tax rates, looking at the benefit rates, how that impacts all of our different taxing jurisdictions. But ultimately we have our printing and final version that comes out first week in April, and it's with you right now.
Right, so the Assembly members all got their budget books just last week or so, and we have our first weekend Saturday budget work session this Saturday. So we'll meet and we'll discuss. We'll hear from the departments about all of their priorities, and then we'll go through several Saturday work sessions. And then when will the budget be back up in front of the Assembly for public hearing?
So I believe May 5th is our public hearing for the budget, or is the Assembly's public hearing for the budget. Between now and then, as you mentioned, there's a number of workshops. Most of those work sessions occur on Saturdays. So we're going to be sitting inside here on those beautiful Saturday afternoons and mornings. But that's when a lot of that work happens, where the Assembly is able to sit down with our directors and managers and talk about the changes to their budgets, and then talk about the function that they provide, the service they provide to the community, what we're doing to improve that, areas we may want to beef up the budget, areas where we're moving funds between those budget lines. That all is going to happen on those Saturday sessions.
Right, so we'll be in the Assembly chambers as the Finance Committee from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. the next 3 Saturdays, so April 16th, 23rd, and 30th to go over the budget. The public obviously is invited to come and listen in. We have an Assembly meeting tonight, April 14th, if folks want to come provide testimony or share their thoughts about the budget. And then as you mentioned, May 5th, the budget will be up for public hearing, and so citizens can come provide public comment then. Probably a really good question to answer that people might want to know is, where can they find information about the budget?
So the best way to find anything that's related to the budget is going to be on our website, fnsb.gov/budget. You can also get there going to the main page, fnsb.gov, and then look for our department tabs, and then look for the budget tab under governance.
Okay, so good to know, fnsb.gov/budget, and
right.
It's all going to live there.
It will, yeah.
So
we've got
everything anybody wants to find about the budget will be right there.
Yep, we've got a link to the full PDF. It's 700 plus pages. We've also got some other videos on there that talk about what is a mill rate, how do you set taxes, how do you develop budgets, really trying to inform folks on all of the work that goes into this, really the most important document that the Assembly approves every year.
Right. So tell us a little bit about your philosophy going into the budget this year and what you wanted to achieve with your budget that you present to the Assembly.
Yeah, thanks. So one of the things that I look at when we look at development of the budget is how do we control our cost, understanding that's a big driver, that's a big thing everyone likes to talk about, is borough budget and then the revenue that we use to generate it, which is most of it comes in through property tax. And then stability. How do we provide the level of service that we've provided in the past and improve that over time? And if we do make adjustments, how do we do that in a way that is realistic for the community, and then also one that meets the budgetary constraints that we have? So stability is a big part of what I look at with the budget, maintaining an appropriate level of spend in relation to our inflationary factors that we see and other factors that we have to deal with when it comes to expenditures and contracts. So I'm pretty happy to say that this budget, I think, meets all those expectations from the administration. We do have an overall increase in the budget this year, but it's under the inflationary amount that we've seen on the last fiscal year terms of about 5%. Last 6 months has been even higher than that. So there's a lot of good things in the budget this year.
Okay, you mentioned stability. How does this budget compare to prior year's budget when it comes to maintaining services and programs?
Yeah, so there's certainly areas where we're going to be asking for some additional funding. As an employer, big employer here in the borough, we've seen challenges with being able to recruit, being able to hire some of our temporary and seasonal positions. We've actually got an increase in there for our summer hire positions by 25%. We were just not competitive. We had, I think, of a couple dozen different positions last year. We only had about a handful that were filled throughout the entire summertime. And that impacts service. So we're looking at how we can maintain those services that we're providing. We've got pools that are shut down because we can't fill with lifeguards. We've got bus routes we're not running because we can't get bus drivers. And so that's all been factored into here on how we can do those recruitments, get those positions filled, and provide those services.
Yeah, in my review of the budget, it looked like for the most part it was fairly flat except for compensation increases. Some of those, as you mentioned, maybe for new hires to increase salaries or incentives to get people to come work and fill those positions. I also know that there are some contractually required compensation increases. You want to talk a little bit about kind of our labor force and how that fits into the budget?
Yeah, so the Fairbanks North Star Borough has about 450 employees. Of those 450 employees, we've got 3 bargaining units, 3 unions that we work with. We have the ASCA contract, our APA contract, and our laborers contract. That's for our kind of line staff. We've got our administrative staff, our management, and then we've got our bus drivers and mechanics. And so of those 3 agreements, we take a lot of pride. The Assembly takes a lot of dedication to making sure those contracts are in alignment with each other. So when we look at cost factors over time, for the most part, they're all kind of lock in step. We've got step increases that are provided for longevity to our employees, roughly about 1.9%. And then we have a COLA adjustment that is also applied to those wages and those positions for all of our different contracts. So this last year, that number came in at actually 5%, but because of the way we negotiated our contracts, it actually, there's a stopgap in there. So that number was 3%. So overall, we had about a 5% increase in wages, yet our overall budget only grew by 3%. So again, our inflationary numbers that we saw for this last fiscal year was around that 5% number. So we feel like we brought things in under a realistic expectation of what we're seeing in the market. But most of those cost drivers are for those contractual obligations we have. We do 3-year agreements with all of our bargaining units and our staff to be able to provide those resources.
And as I recall, we're just at the beginning of most of those agreements.
We just started year 1.
So I know that the capital improvement program has been a project that's really important to you in your time in office. Can you tell us a little bit about how the capital improvement program and maintenance reserve fund and forgetting the name of the multi-year fund to deal with kind of ordinary maintenance, but I know that those have been priorities. Can you tell us a little bit how those fit into your budget vision?
Yeah, so one thing that the Assembly did, they started, I want to say it was about 3 years ago, is put in place a mechanism that said when the mayor recommends a budget that you have to include a certain portion of your revenue as dedicated to capital. And this is just the mayor's budget, so the Assembly could change it later if they wanted. But they said that started off at 7%. So 7% of the revenue we expect to collect, of tax revenue we expect to collect, would be dedicated to capital. Since then, it's gone from 7 to 9%, and then from 9% to 10%. So the FY23 budget includes a 10% contribution to the CIPMR, which is the Capital Improvement Maintenance Reserve, which is the main fund that we use to pay for the CIP, the Capital Improvement Program.
Is that about $12 million this year?
And that's just over 12 million, I think 12.1, 12.2.
All right. And we've already, as an Assembly, gone through a lot of the capital projects. So we've just set the list of capital projects. And I imagine we're going to see some of those year 1 capital projects in this budget?
Yeah, all of the year 1 projects that were in the Capital Improvement Program have been incorporated into the capital budget that you have with the operating budget before the Assembly right now.
Right. One of the great things about that, of course, is that with the CIPMR, the funding is already there to move those projects forward from that fund. So it's fiscally constrained, and everything will be funded out of money that we've already set aside for it. So we've been planning ahead.
We have, and that fund actually carries a balance too. So if there's adjustments that come up throughout the year or projects that need to be realigned, the Assembly has that flexibility to be able to use some of those additional funds or move projects around.
Yeah, good. One thing the Assembly's been hearing a lot about this year, switching topics, is valuation and the significant increases in some property owners' property tax assessment values. So can you talk a little bit about how valuation works and where we're at with that in the borough?
Yeah, so the borough property tax base is valued every year. Each property is individually assessed. And that's a really important factor. It's actually a statutory requirement that we do a total valuation every year. So this year, our total value increased by about 700 million, just under 700 million. That's more than we've seen in prior years. And a couple different factors to that. One, we've seen just a very hot market when it comes to residential real estate. We had about a 10% increase across the board for residential properties. Residential commercial properties, we had about a 15% increase across the board. Some folks saw more, some folks saw a little bit less. But generally speaking, those are higher numbers than we've seen on the residential side in quite some time. Inflation probably is driving a little bit of that. The constriction in the housing market is driving a little bit of that. But overall, we saw a pretty significant increase in the total valuation. The way that we generate our budgets is we look at it from a operational perspective, what the capital demands are for the budget. So we do those calculations looking at our contracts, looking at our other obligations, whether it be through multi-year agreements we have for contractual services, not just labor. And so we come up with a dollar amount. We then take that number essentially and divide it by the total taxable value to get a rate, or what we call a mill rate. And so it's 1/1,000,000th the value of whatever your assessment is essentially what your tax generation is. So because of that large increase and because of our ability to maintain our cost, we actually are looking at a 1.2, 1.3 mil decrease from last year's numbers. So that's a good thing. What it means is that depending on where you're at in that range of improvement and value increase that you've seen with your property, you may actually pay less or the same amount as you have in prior years. Even though the value is different, the value went up, the rate came down by about 1.2 mils.
Great. Yeah, you anticipated my next question, which was going to be about the mill rate. And you have your assessed value, and then you have your budget needs, and that from that's how we get to the mill rate. And as you said, in this case, because we've maintained a budget at a fairly flat level, the mill rate actually decreases. But in your budget, you've also proposed some additional tax rate relief, right? Is that right?
Yeah, so there's a number of other areas. We look at not just the general fund, but we also have the solid waste collection district. We've got a number of other funds that are impacted by the total valuation. In fact, actually, our service areas are all impacted by this as well. And in all of our service jurisdictions, taxing jurisdictions, fall under the tax cap requirement. And so what you see is when you see large increases in the value of your taxing jurisdiction and you're able to maintain your budgets, it can bring down that rate. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the tax cap, and I know that's something that people ask about quite often. You want to talk a little bit about the tax cap and how it works? I'm sorry, I should call it by its proper name, the tax revenue cap.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. It's the tax revenue cap is just that. It caps the amount of revenue that the borough can bring in every year. So when we look at that number over time, there's a calculation that looks at prior year budgets. It looks at consumer price index increases. It looks at new construction and then kicks out a number of, okay, this is the most revenue that you can collect from all of your different sources, your taxing sources. So that's sales tax, property tax, et cetera. So I'm proud to say that this budget comes in just over 12 million under the tax cap. So that's pretty significant. That's a big number. And there's a number of different reasons for that. One, we saw pretty big increases in home values. We saw a lot of transactions. We had actually a decent number of new construction happen this last year. I think last year exceeded the 5 prior years for total annual numbers for new construction of housing. So we've got a lot of activity going on in the borough.
All right. One of the biggest budget items for the Assembly every year is the local contribution to education. You want to talk a little bit about where you're at with our local contribution and what your thoughts are and your philosophy for funding local schools?
Yeah, so local requirement for local contribution for education is a statutory requirement. We're well above the minimum requirement, which is about 33 million. My budget this year includes a 49 million roughly transfer or budget line for the school district. That's the same as it was in the prior year. When we look at what we've done in the past, it's not the most that we've given, but that we've had some significant adjustments in enrollment, borough's position, be able to provide that assistance to the district. And so I've been pretty clear when we started our budget back in December of what my intentions were with the administration and the school board. And what I told them was, you're going to get the same that you had in the prior year. So that's what we have in the budget. It's my understanding that the school board has approved a budget that is roughly $51 million. So they're asking for an additional $2 million. And with what we've put forward, I believe there's room for the Assembly to take that up for consideration.
So the Assembly will have some choices to make down the road as it hears from the district and of course everybody, all the other departments as well. But how are we doing on our debt service? I know people can be concerned about bonds and what we're paying in bonds. And my understanding is that we're actually doing pretty good on debt service. We're retiring a fair amount of our debt and towards the end of paying off a fair number of our bonds. Can you tell us a little bit about our debt service?
Yeah, so our debt service is mainly education. We have a small amount that is for kind of general fund items. We've got some parks and things in there. I think it was the 2016 bond was the last one that we did. But of our total bond debt, I want to say we're about $80 million. After our payments this next year, we'll be down around $70 million, which is pretty good for a community of our size. We're continuing to pay off those notes. We did do what do they call like
a refinance?
We did a refinance here a few short years ago when the rates got a lot better, and so that did save us some money in the short term. But ultimately, that's a big driver. So we spend about $12 to $14 million a year on school debt, or just really our debt notes, period. Again, most of that being school district. But as we continue to move forward, one of the things we're definitely watching really closely is the school debt reimbursement piece, which is historically the state has provided assistance to communities for doing school projects, construction projects, because it's ultimately the state's responsibility. And so through that agreement, they have provided up to 70% of the reimbursement for the cost of those bonds every year. As folks may know, this is a pretty big item, and it has been vetoed a number of times, both under Governor Dunleavy and then also under Governor Walker. And this is a huge impact to our community. $12 million is the overall debt load. What we've seen in the past is anywhere between $7 and $10 million in assistance from the state, which comes out to be about $1 mil worth of tax rate that the state has been helping us with. In the prior years, that's been vetoed. The Assembly has continued to move forward with fully funding that out of our local taxpayer dollars. What that's done is it's given us about a half of a year's worth of reserves. The budget that I put forward to the Assembly includes a full payment of the school debt bond reimbursement by the borough, with about half of it being picked up by us and half by the state. Sounds like in negotiations that may end up being the full amount. They actually may be paying for prior years. So there may be a bit of a surplus there. One thing we did propose last year in the budget, we'll propose again this year, is that if there is any lapse, so we do receive additional funds through school debt bond reimbursement, that it go back to the debt service fund. And the intent there is that, one, we could either pay off that debt sooner, or two, we have reserves in the debt service fund to be able to take care of years where maybe the state doesn't pay for that and it doesn't negatively impact the tax base.
Yeah, you hit a really important point in that answer. And when the state reduces funding under its obligations to local government, the taxpayers end up picking up that bill. How are you feeling about the state support this coming year?
So I think out of the 4 years I've been doing budgets now with the borough, it's probably the most likely that it's ever been that we will get at least partial, if not full payment for school debt bond reimbursement. So I do feel pretty comfortable with that. We did build the budget, like I said, based on the state contributing only half. So we still do have roughly $4 million worth of local contribution to the tax fund. My intent behind that is, again, if the state doesn't pay, we have the funding available in the budget to be able to make those payments. If they do, then that gives us a full year's worth of debt payment in the debt service fund. You know, in the future, should we see lack of commitment from the state to be able to help us pay for that assistance?
Yeah, well, let's hope that the legislature comes through and actually makes some decisions before the end of our budget process. I can tell you from the Assembly's perspective, that's one of the hardest parts about budgeting, is that having to adopt a budget in May sometimes without finality from the state on what its obligations are. It creates a lot of uncertainty and risk in our budget.
That was a big concern last year, where the state, I think, went all the way till they turned into a pumpkin at the very end of the session, and we still had no budget. Definitely large factors to take into consideration when we look at our local budgets.
Yeah. I want to go back to one item involving employees and our workforce, and that's kind of our total number of employees. Where did you come out this year on number of employees? Or are we adding, subtracting, staying about the same?
So I believe we've got a couple FTEs that are going to be added to the roles. We do have some transitions. So we've got a number of perm term positions that are kind of coming off the books. We've got some other project positions that are coming on, but we do have a couple full-time positions that are going to be rolled into this. One of them is an additional code enforcement officer. This was approved under the current budget by the Assembly about a month ago. That full-time FTE was incorporated into this budget. So we'll have two kind of Title 18 code enforcement officers out on the streets. We are also asking for a customer service rep for our transit services. This allows us to be able to provide more consistent services from our transit center downtown. They are the folks that do the bookings for Vantran, and then overall just manage the system and any customer issues that happen throughout the week.
All right. Well, I was going to ask you about the budget book. We've got this hefty budget book here, and for the public who might be wanting to know where to turn to this book to find information, can you talk about what the highlights are and what you think the most important things for members of the public to look at?
Yeah. We have limited paper copies. As you can tell, there's about 800 pages here. It actually is pretty expensive. So when you do the analysis of what it takes to print a version of this every year, it's like $100+.
Right.
And then that's not including staff time. So we really encourage folks to be able to access that online. It's again available on our website, fnsb.gov/budget.
Is it a searchable document online?
It is.
Okay.
So you're able to do, it's an Adobe project, Adobe version. It's a PDF. So you're able to use the search function. It's tabbed, so you can go through, look at every department, look at every tab, just like the Assembly would have on their budget books on their computers.
Great. So I always like the mayor's message because it gives me your philosophy and highlights. What are the other important sections for you?
Yeah, so right at the very beginning, you're going to have mayor's message. That's, again, a good highlight section. There actually is a staff-generated highlight section right after that. And so I want to say that's some of the early pages of the book for folks to be able to kind of flip through, get an idea of one. I've always been very clear of here's what the budget is, here's what the prior numbers are, here's the increases, decreases you're going to see, both in total numbers. So, again, the budget has grown by about $5 million. So it's 180-ish million versus the 175 from last year. And then what the rates are. So what's the anticipated tax rate for the area-wide fund? Most folks are looking for that big number. But then after that, staff has a highlight section that's really helpful.
Yeah, and one of the sections I really like to read myself is the kind of the department summary before each department tab to find out what their their highlights of the year were, what their goals and objectives were, kind of a summary of each department's work throughout the budget. So all in all, there's a lot of great information in here about what your administration is doing and about what each department is doing.
Yeah, that's a great place to go to get more information on what a department's doing. So if you're looking at the mayor's office, you can pull up the mayor's office tab. There'll be a summary for each division of the projects that they're working on, accomplishments that the department has achieved the last year, challenges. There's also some statistical information in there. So if you're interested in, what statistics are we tracking? Our community planning department looks at number of permits that they've issued, number of variances that they've been able to provide, number of plat applications, and they track that throughout the years. So you could look and say, okay, this department's asking for more money. Are they actually doing more work? And you can use some of those statistics to say, okay, wow, look at that. The clerk's office had 10,000 phone calls last year, and
Right.
now they have 15,000 phone calls.
Yeah, it's a great way to see what the borough employees are doing for the citizens, and on behalf of the citizens, all the different things that everyone does. All of the budget book is important. The Assembly spends a lot of time in the expenditure budget. Anything in the expenditure budget that you want to highlight?
There's some great summary tables I might want to point out at the very beginning of the book. It's in the summary tab, and that's where you've got the revenue summaries that looks at all of our revenue generation that we have for the borough. And again, most of it is property tax. We are a property tax town. We are a property tax borough. We do have sales tax that comes in. We do have other grants and funds. Interfund transfers are all accounted for in that revenue tab. Great resource. That's in the early 20s, I want to say, 20, page 20 through 20 or 30. Same thing with our expenditure summary. That's also there as well. You'll have your FTE counts by division. You'll look at the changes between departments. Where are they going up? Where are they going down? You'll look at the overall budget increases for those divisions, and those are the summaries. You could always go to the division or department page to get a more detailed analysis of like, okay, is this all wages? Is this all contractual? Where are these increases coming from?
Yeah, and one thing I really like about the borough's budget is it's very transparent when it comes to every aspect of each department's budget, right? So every line item is listed. You can see how much department is proposing to spend on copying, on books, on travel, on training, on office supplies, which really gives people who are looking, like you said, that ability to really get into the details of operations and see where the money goes.
The other thing too is it shows you the historical numbers.
Right.
So, budgetary numbers are different than actuals.
Right.
And oftentimes, a budget is an estimate. We're looking at right now, fiscal year starts in July, so that's still 2.5 months away. So you're looking at almost 12 to 14 months in the future of what you anticipate your expenditures to be. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't.
Right. Budgets are estimates, appropriations are law.
Oh, you've been listening to the CFO.
But it's a great point because through each of the pages of the budget book, there is comparative information. So you can look at proposed for FY23, which is what we're taking up. You can look at what the approved budget was for FY22, which is the fiscal year just ending. And you can also see the revised fiscal year 22 budget. So that includes all of the appropriations that the Assembly made. So you can compare what we estimated last year, what we actually did last year, and what we're estimating for this coming fiscal year, as well as looking back at least to FY20 and almost all of the departments to see historical information. So you can keep track of how good we are at estimating.
Yeah, and that's a great tool. I mean, oftentimes we find areas where we've estimated a higher revenue line than we actually are bringing in, and we look at that every year and throughout the year to say, are we really actually doing what we said we were doing, both from a revenue perspective and then also from that budgetary perspective?
Yeah, and from my perspective as an Assembly member, I see that in your proposals. We'll go through the budget process at the Assembly, and I'll hear departments say, well, we estimated that was going to be $2,000 last year. We didn't really spend that much, so we're going to reduce it to $1,500 this year. Mm-hmm. And so I can tell that your administration is paying attention to those details and not just making guesses, but looking at trends and figuring out where things should come out.
Certainly.
So is there anything else in the budget book that you want to point out in particular?
One of the other areas that I think is really important to check out is the multi-year programs. So we have appropriations, operational appropriations in the budget that are one-year document, or one-year appropriations. So at the end of the year, the funding lapses, which means that if we don't spend the money, then it goes back to the general fund, and it basically gets rolled in with everything else. The multi-year programs are ones that are special. One where the administration and the Assembly agrees that we want to put money in these buckets, and they maybe are multi-year projects. Or multi-year programs, and we don't want that funding to lapse to the general fund. We want it to stay in that particular project for a period of time. And so we've got a list of what those projects are, and I'd be happy to kind of go through a few of them.
Sure. Would probably be worth going through a few of them. And I just want to reiterate that, from an Assembly perspective, the multi-year projects are really important because it helps us plan for known projects over time so we can save for them. So we're not hit with a big expense when we need to do something. We're actually planning out ahead into the future. One of my favorite multi-year projects over time has been the LiDAR mapping that the borough has done. It's directly helped with floodplain mapping, for example, and taken a lot of property out of floodplains as we've been able to better map map those areas, which has reduced homeowner and taxpayer insurance rates. And so that's an example of a multi-year project that's giving direct value back to our residents.
And we're actually, this year is another year for one of our aerial shoots. So they're working on that calendar, working on calendaring that right now.
So talk to us some more about some of the important multi-year projects.
Yeah, let's flip to that page here in the budget.
I was going to flip there, but it was a lot of pages.
There's a lot of pages. So this starts on page 704. 703 is the summary. And this lists out all of those different multi-year programs that we have established over years. Some of these have been around for a decade or more. Some of them are more recent. You had mentioned the LiDAR shoot, the GIS kind of mapping component, where the Assembly says we're going to contribute a couple $100,000 a year to this, and then every 2 or 3 years on the cycle we will do that aerial shoot. This helps with our planning department. This helps with our assessing department, and just the community at large. As a contractor in my private life, I've used it as a great way to get in a kind of a bird's eye view of a particular lot or area of the borough.
One thing I noticed in this year's budget book that I really appreciate is you've included the available balance in each of the multi-year project funds, because I know the Assembly asks about that every year.
Yep, and that's an important part of these multi-year programs is the Assembly puts funding in there every year. Some of them are to build for an event like the GIS mapping, or we have ones for like levee recertification. So this is the levee that protects the Fairbanks and North Pole area from flooding on the Tanana. Our recert is every 10 years, so we could contribute, I want to say it's $100,000 a year to that fund, because it's about $1 million every 10 years to recertify. We also have a separate line for maintenance. So we do brushing, we do grading of that important piece of infrastructure to maintain its integrity over the life of that particular item.
Any new multi-year projects that folks should know about?
Nothing that's new, if you will, like just introduced this year. We do have one that was new, I want to say a year or two ago, and this is our Public Works Maintenance, Deferred Maintenance Fund. And so we have our CIPMR, our Capital Improvement Program, which looks at new projects, it looks at deferred maintenance, recapitalization, but we also, we spend money every year in operations on maintenance.
Right, that was the fund I was trying to think of the name of earlier. So that's the Deferred Maintenance Fund.
It is, yeah. I think the official title is Repair and Maintenance.
Okay.
Public Works Repair and Maintenance Fund.
Got it. That's on page 704.
It is. So, and that particular program, what we did is we took a bit of the money that we put aside in our maintenance program every year in the operations budget. So let's put this into a multi-year program, because we had issues where projects were lapsing at year end, and there might have been a project that the department wanted to get started on, but we were within the 2-month window of the year end, so they couldn't get it started and get it obligated before the budget expired. And so we said, okay, the purpose here is to do maintenance and repairs. So let's put money in a fund that we can continue to work on. And some of these are multi-year projects. They may start in May, or you may start in June. Well, the fiscal year ends in July, end of June, early July. July 1's the new fiscal year. So this allows staff to have more of that flexibility and be able to push these projects out more consistently.
I was going to switch topics real quick to user fees. So a lot of local residents interface with the borough in the library, the pool, the civic center, Pioneer Park, wherever, and user fees can be attached to certain things like swim lessons or renting the pool. Any major changes in the user fee section this year, or significant changes?
No major changes to our user fee schedule in this year's budget. One of the things that we are working on, and we started this last year, is to come at our user fee schedule with a more consistent approach. So in the past, we had kind of a wide variety of different fees that we charged, and they were not necessarily united on a impact to community, impact to department, cost to be able to provide those services. And so we had some user groups that were paying much, much more than comparatively to other groups that were paying maybe much, much less, without taking into consideration those different aspects, such as the cost of the infrastructure, the maintenance, things like that. So we are coming at it with this new approach to be able to look at a tiered system. So essentially you've got certain services that you expect to fully subsidize. You've got other services that you expect the user group to pay for a portion, if not maybe all, of that type of activity. And so we're working to better understand our user fee schedule, the cost associated with those different activities, and then build out a more robust system to do that analysis. We're not there this year to make those adjustments in the budget, but that is something that's coming.
Good. I know that we always get questions from people about, especially when we're talking about user fees, about what it's going to cost to take advantage of some of our services. So appreciate the focus on a standardized approach.
Yeah, that's definitely something we've heard from the public and the Assembly is, we want to make sure we've got some methodology to this, and it's not just, well, I feel like we need to be paying more, or,
right.
I feel like this group needs to be, more subsidized. We need to have some metrics behind that.
So I've asked you a lot of questions about the budget. What have I not asked about that you want to talk about?
Oh boy. I think when it comes to the budget, it can be really intimidating for a member of the public to pick up this 800-page document and be able to make sense of it. I really would encourage folks to come to the work sessions we have on Saturday or listen to them if they're recorded and available online, where you can learn more about a particular department. Maybe you're just really interested in Parks and Rec and you want to understand, what is it that Parks and Rec does? Well, they've $10 million in their budget this year. Where does that money go? That's a great way to dive in deeper, or talk to our directors and managers and find out, what is it that you're working on? What is it that you have needs? And I know Assembly members do this with our directors and our managers. And how can we do things better? A lot of ideas that come in through my inbox are from residents that are intimately involved in a user group or a particular facility and have identified some way to make this, our budget, better. And I really appreciate that feedback.
Is there still a budget tool on the website where people can adjust budget categories? Or
I'm not sure if we've got that up and running this year. That was a tool that we had going for a few years. It's a good question, and I'm going to have to look into that. But
all right. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point. The Saturday work sessions where kind of the grain is milled, so to speak, with the budget, are a great place for the public to learn the ins and outs and really the nitty-gritty detail of the budget process. Of course, the public can come in person and listen while the departments present and the Assembly does its work. But they're also being streamed now, both through Zoom, and I think the recordings are on the clerk's office webpage afterward as well. So there's a lot of opportunities for the public to listen. And you hit a good point. The budget book is intimidating, but if you take a few minutes and spend some time looking at it, it starts to make a lot more sense, especially as you look at all the detail and you can really see. And of course, anybody in the public can ask you or any Assembly member questions about, what this is or what that means, and we do our best to answer.
And if we don't have the answer, we can always look into it.
That's right. Sometimes the best answer is, I don't know, but I'll find out.
Yeah. And sometimes you learn some really interesting things.
Right. I've learned more about how the borough works going through, this will be my, I think, 7th budget. So to me, it's always a learning experience. Every budget season, I learn something new about what the borough does and how it works. So it's always a very interesting time of year for me where I get to, really dive into the details.
So Matt, maybe if from the Finance Committee perspective, what are some things that you're going to be looking for in the next few days and weeks as we kind of dive into this? And what is it you're really looking for from maybe a staff, for the Assembly?
Yeah, so I think from the Assembly Finance Committee perspective, what's really valuable for us is hearing from the individual departments and divisions about what they're doing and what their needs are. I'm always amazed every year at how willing the divisions and departments are to kind of maintaining a level budget, being sensitive to the tax base, but also identifying the areas where they need improvement or need help. Sometimes, like you mentioned, it's code enforcement. Heard a lot from our community about code enforcement over the last year, and we amended the current fiscal year's budget, and it's in your proposed budget for the next fiscal year. So I'm sure we'll talk about that and the need for that. And this happens every year, is somebody will say, a department will say, there's this thing that's really important to us, and here's why. And so, it really gives the Assembly an opportunity to learn and to ask questions. So I think, number one, we're looking for, that conversation with the departments about what their needs are. Two, the number of employees, the FTEs, is always a question for the Assembly. With every employee comes benefits and ongoing pension obligations, and so the Assembly is always sensitive to, the number of employees we have, and not, injudiciously adding employees. So that is always something that we're interested in hearing. As the process goes forward, each Assembly member has their own interests and priorities, and so it's a really good opportunity for the public to hear, what all of us are thinking and what our priorities are in terms of what we're hearing from constituents. So,
and maybe for the public's benefit on this one, the Finance Committee takes up the budget. We work through, or the Assembly works through this over the next few weeks, and then makes a recommendation to the body.
That's right.
And then you hand off the work that you've done in Finance Committee to the presiding officer, and that's that May 5th meeting where the public comes in and provides testimony. So it's possible that there could be amendments that are taken up and considered in Finance Committee, and then maybe even taken up again if they weren't approved, or rehashed or redebated, if you will, with the Assembly as a whole.
That's right, and one of the great things about our budget process, it takes a lot of time and it goes on for a while. It starts this weekend, goes through May 5th or May 12th if we have a lot of testimony on May 5th. But it gives us time to fine tune throughout the process. One of the other things that I forgot to mention that I listen for and I look for is what's coming from the state. And oftentimes you don't know what's coming from the state until the very end, and you're making adjustments at the last minute. So in terms of process, it's in the Finance Committee's hands now. We have the next 3 Saturdays to look at it. At the end of those 3 Saturdays, the Finance Committee will adopt a recommended budget to send to the full Assembly. Then May 5th, the full Assembly will take up that recommended budget, and you're right, at that point there can be new amendments, old amendments. It's great fun because it's just like kind of this live process. It's constantly evolving, and it's very responsive to what's going on in the state and the community.
So depending on what happens at the state level, we don't have a budget yet.
Right.
That could all change there too.
Right. So for example, if the legislature adopted a budget and the governor signed it before May 5th and school bond debt reimbursement was fully funded, that could be an area where we came back with an amendment to change that in our budget, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Which, that's significant. That amount is about $4 million.
Right. Same thing with some of the other state funds we receive. Community matching grants, education funding could be impacted by what the state does. So there are a lot of variables, and sometimes we don't know, how those will play out until after our budget is adopted, which is why the budget's an estimate.
Yep. One more thing I maybe would add here too is in the timeline when we look at this, we generate a estimated tax rate as part of the recommended budget from the administration. As we go through time, we're currently going through BOE hearings. This is where community members disagree with their valuation. They're able to challenge that, be heard by a community board, and then they make a determination on valuation. As we work through that over the next month, the actual rates that are set for taxes are based on the approved budget, the valuations, once those are all finalized, which are not until June.
Right.
And so we actually the Assembly, I should say, sets those mill rates both for general fund, non-area wide, service areas in the June timeframe. So even though we may have a budget approved in May, you still have to wait till June to have those rates set.
I think our June 9th meeting is the date for the mill rate levy resolution. So, yep. You mentioned a little bit about different taxing jurisdictions. Do you want to talk a little bit about the different taxing jurisdictions? Because that can be confusing sometimes. You have area-wide, non-area-wide, you have service areas, you have solid waste.
I'll give a kind of a brief rundown. So in your tax bill, you'll have a bunch of numbers and dollar amounts for these different taxing jurisdictions. You have your area-wide, your general area-wide fund, which is for animal control, parks and rec, education, well, education's separate, but it's your community planning department, all of your libraries, all of your kind of general government costs. Those are the things that everyone pays, whether you're a city resident, whether you're a borough in the greater borough area, that rate is there. You also have the non-area-wide funds. So these are things like, for us, it's emergency operations and emergency medical. So the ambulances, if you're outside the cities, there's a separate mill rate.
And that's non-area-wide because the cities have their own emergency services.
Yeah, good, great for that clarification. So non-area-wide means any area in the borough outside the cities. So we don't double tax, if you will, for those services that you have in the city versus outside the city. We also have the solid waste collection district, which includes the city of North Pole, but not the city of Fairbanks, and all of the rest of the borough. So another separate taxing jurisdiction. And then you have all of your road service areas, your fire service areas. We have a sewer district. We have a lighting district. About 100 plus of those different taxing jurisdictions. So on your tax bill, you may have several different line items. You'll have, the roughly 12.5 mils for general government. You'll have a 0.6 for solid waste collection district. If you're in that area, you'll have maybe a fire service district, a road service area district rate, and all of those add up. And so that comes up with your total bill. So even though the borough rate could be low, you may live in a service district that has a larger mill rate. We have our sewer district, I think, is 20 mils.
Yeah, and that's why I asked that question, because the borough sets like a general mill rate, and that's kind of what we talk about when we're talking about our mill rate. But depending upon where you live, whether it's in a city or not in the city, whether it's in a road service area and what road service area, the total mill rate that adds up at the end is going to vary depending upon where you live.
It is, and it varies in the city, outside the city. There's some instances where if you live within the cities, you may pay less in property tax than the service areas outside. It really speaks to the a la carte model that we have for local government, where you as a taxpayer, as a resident, get to choose, I want to have a road service area, I want to have fire protection. But it also means if you don't pay for that, you don't get it either.
So while the assembly sets the general mill rate, the road service areas or the fire service areas are in charge of setting their own. So if you live in a road service area, the people who live in that road service area get to set their own mill rate for what their needs are.
Within the tax cap.
Within the tax cap.
That tax revenue cap, yep.
But still, I mean, that in terms of who makes those decisions, it starts, there's a higher level assembly, but then as you get down into these smaller taxing jurisdiction, it really comes down to the people who live there to make those decisions for their area.
Yep. Your respective commissioners for each one of those commissions.
So other questions for me as this goes into the hands of the assembly?
No, I just appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and talk about the budget. And I hope folks found this educational. If folks want to know anything more about this, like you said, reach out to a fellow assembly member or the mayor. We'd be happy to walk folks through it.
Great. Well, thanks for having me here to talk about this. I look forward to seeing you on Saturday and hearing from all the departments on Saturday. This Saturday is going to be a great day because we'll get the overviews from each of the departments. So for people who show up and listen in person or listen online, you'll be able to hear what every department in the borough is proposing and what it's looking at for its coming fiscal year.
Yeah, and that's here at the JHAC, the Juanita Helms Administration Center, the borough building. Down on the Chena River.
Right, and in the assembly chamber. So walk straight through the front doors and straight back, and you'll find us there.
All right.
Please visit our website, fnsb.gov, and check out our budget page, specifically designed to inform you about the budget process and what's coming next.